Have you ever had to play peacekeeper in your household?
I broke every rule you are supposed to follow with family, and I still sleep fine. Are you ready for a shocking truth? They turned against me, filed papers to seize my company, and walked into court smiling like it was already over. But before we ever got to that courtroom, there was one small choice I made years ago that ended up being the reason their entire plan fell apart, and it still makes me laugh when I think about how badly they underestimated me. Back when I started the company, I had nothing except a laptop, a small grant I managed to win from a business development program, and a pile of sleepless nights. My parents loved the idea of telling their friends that their daughter was an entrepreneur, but the truth is they never believed it would last. They offered what they called a family loan, which sounded generous on the surface, but the terms were vague, and my gut told me there would be strings I could never cut free from. I thanked them, typed a very short but very direct email, and declined. I remember hitting send and feeling like I might regret it, but it turned out to be the single smartest thing I ever did. For years, I built the business without their help. The growth was slow at first, and I had to scrape by, but eventually I had real clients, actual employees, and steady revenue. I was proud of what I built, and even though my parents rarely asked about the details, they were quick to take credit in conversations with relatives and neighbors. They said things like, "We helped her get started," or "It's really a family project." At the time, I rolled my eyes and let it slide. I figured if bragging gave them something to talk about at barbecues, fine. But years later, those little lies turned into their supposed proof that they had invested in my company. It started with whispers. A client asked me during a meeting whether my parents still had a say in decisions. I laughed it off, but then another client asked, and another. By the third time, I realized something was going on. Ethan, my younger brother, posted online about protecting the family's legacy and hinted that my company was only alive because of my parents' financial support. I confronted him, and he smirked like he had just hit a nerve. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about bragging anymore, it was coordinated. The real hit came when I got a letter from a lawyer representing my parents. They claimed they had made an early financial contribution that gave them rights to a controlling stake. I stared at that paper, reading it again and again, trying to process how people who raised me could actually try to take away the one thing I had built entirely on my own. But anger only lasted about an hour. After that, I pulled up a document I had drafted months earlier, one I created not because I saw this coming, but because I always worried about protecting my employees. I had set up what's called a payroll-first trust, basically a structure that ensures that, no matter what happens with ownership disputes, wages for staff are secured and ring-fenced. To my parents, who thought they were about to take over a money machine, this was a brick wall. They wanted control of cash flow, but all they found was a system where every dollar went first to staff salaries and operational commitments. There was nothing they could just sweep up and redirect to themselves. I did not call them. I did not argue. I simply filed the paperwork, and when their lawyer tried to demand financial access, the trust documents were already in effect. The irony was sharp. By trying to make a grab, they actually triggered protections that made the company even harder to touch. And the best part? My employees never even felt the turbulence. They got paid on time, like always, while my parents sat there fuming over why the numbers weren't adding up in their favor. Of course, I knew this wouldn't stop them. People like that, once they decide to attack, don't just walk away after the first obstacle. But I wanted them to hit the wall hard enough that they would have to reveal their real intentions. I didn't want conversations about misunderstandings or family miscommunications. I wanted them exposed for exactly what they were doing, trying to steal. And when I watched their next move unfold, I realized I had judged them correctly. Instead of backing off, they escalated. They went from private threats to public ones, from whispers to documents, and then they made the mistake that told me they were never going to stop until I destroyed their case completely. They hired an attorney who specialized in aggressive family asset claims, and they filed for an emergency hearing, claiming they needed to protect family funds. I sat there with the paperwork in my hands and laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because it was so desperate. They thought they were tightening the noose, but all they had done was put themselves in a spotlight they couldn't step out of. That was the exact moment I called Maya, my attorney, and said something I had been waiting years to say: let's stop playing defense. And that decision, to flip the game on them instead of just shielding myself, was the line that changed everything. I thought they would back down when the money tap they wanted did not move. Instead, they hired a lawyer and tried something louder. When the letter about the emergency hearing landed on my desk, I realized my parents were not bluffing, and they were not embarrassed by what they were doing. In fact, they were proud enough to double down, and they were ready to drag my name, my company, and my reputation into court with them. They had convinced themselves that this was their righteous fight, and that the story they had been telling for years about how they had helped me start everything was strong enough to convince strangers in suits who had never met me. What I underestimated was just how quickly their lawyer, a woman named Ruth Delgado, would weaponize that story in ways I had never imagined. Within 2 weeks, clients began forwarding me carefully packaged documents that Ruth's office had circulated. These packets contained cherry-picked screenshots from family group chats where I had once thanked my parents for support, which in context had meant nothing more than emotional support after a rough week, but when isolated, the word support looked like financial contribution. Mixed with these were vague references to conversations we had at dinners, comments taken out of context, and phrases Ethan had sent to group threads, all painting a picture that my company had been a family-built venture and that I had simply taken credit for myself. Seeing those packets for the first time made me physically ill, not because I feared they would win, but because I knew how damaging rumors can be when they spread unchecked. Clients do not want drama. They want stability, reliability, and guarantees that their supplier will not collapse under personal chaos. Even the whiff of instability can send them running, and I knew Ruth's strategy was not necessarily to win outright in court, but to make me bleed out clients until my company became unrecognizable. For a few days, I felt like I was trapped in quicksand, with every new email from a nervous client pulling me further down. The only thing that kept me from collapsing was Nadia, my operations lead, who walked into my office with a binder so thick it looked like she had been preparing for this moment her whole life. That binder was what we called the heartbeat ledger, an ongoing, notarized, time-stamped record of every transaction, every invoice, and every incoming payment the company had ever processed. Nadia, being obsessive about systems, had been maintaining it for years without anyone asking her to, because she always feared one day we might face an audit. This ledger was not just clean, it was bulletproof. It showed, line by line, that our funding had come from the seed grant, from actual sales, and from a very small angel investment I had secured early on, none of which had any connection to my parents. Buried in my inbox, I also found something I had forgotten about entirely: the short, formal email I had written years ago declining my parents' so-called family loan. It was polite, professional, and absolutely clear that I had never accepted their money. Reading it again, I realized this single email could become the sharpest weapon in my arsenal. Rather than panicking or calling my parents to demand answers, I did something colder. With Maya's help, I invited a handful of our biggest clients to a webinar, not to vent or to share emotional stories, but to show them, line by line, the truth. Maya walked them through the heartbeat ledger, highlighted the decline email, and explained in calm, simple language why the rumors were false and why the people spreading them were acting in bad faith. Then, instead of asking for sympathy, she gave them something practical, a one-page agreement stating that any third party who interfered with our deliverables would assume liability for delays or damages. It was a quiet but powerful statement. By signing, the clients essentially locked arms with us against my parents' interference. Within an hour, 2 of the biggest clients signed. By the next day, 3 more followed. The impact was immediate and brutal, though not on me. Ruth's carefully constructed rumor campaign collapsed when the very people it was designed to spook refused to play along. What she thought would be the wedge that split me from my business relationships instead became the glue that bound us tighter. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled, because I realized that while my parents could throw accusations into the wind, They could not rewrite notarized ledgers, signed contracts, or my own words from years earlier. But the story did not end there. People like Ruth do not back down because of a single checkmate. Instead of retreating, she shifted strategies. With a straight face, she filed for an emergency hearing, claiming my parents needed to protect family assets before I could supposedly move them offshore or hide them. The absurdity of the claim would have been laughable if it had not required me to respond legally, but in some strange way, I welcomed it. For weeks, I had been fighting shadows, whispers, and carefully curated packets designed to destroy my reputation quietly. Now, finally, everything was going to be dragged into the light of a courtroom where documents, ledgers, and real signatures mattered more than family gossip. When Maya called to tell me the date was set, she asked me how I felt. I surprised myself when I told her I was relieved. For the first time since this mess began, I wanted a confrontation. I wanted to stop shielding myself and start showing them what real leverage looked like. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about exposing just how far my parents were willing to go to rewrite history for their own gain. Cliffhanger: Ruth, their lawyer, did not blink when the clients refused to cave. She simply filed for an emergency hearing, and as I read the caption on the case, I laughed once out loud before picking up the phone and telling Maya, "Let's stop playing defense." The morning after Maya confirmed the emergency hearing date, I sat at my desk and tried to absorb the reality that my own parents were preparing to stand across from me in a courtroom, fully prepared to brand me as untrustworthy, selfish, and ungrateful. I had spent years defending myself in subtle ways, smiling politely when relatives repeated my parents' version of events, brushing off remarks about family support, and swallowing my frustration when Ethan made smug comments online. But this was the first time I was forced to admit that none of those small gestures of patience had ever mattered, because people who are determined to rewrite history will not stop until someone shoves the truth in their face in a way they cannot ignore. What struck me most was not that they were willing to embarrass me publicly, but that they were willing to gamble with my employees' livelihoods and my clients' trust just to prove a point that was never true to begin with. Maya and I spent hours reviewing every detail of the filings, and as we went through them line by line, she noticed something that at first seemed irrelevant. Ruth Delgado, my parents' lawyer, had once submitted an invoice to my company for a consultation related to a compliance audit we had done years earlier. It had been a small, routine matter, so minor I had completely forgotten about it, but Maya recognized that even the tiniest past professional relationship could present an ethics issue if Ruth was now representing the other side. On paper, Ruth had been paid by my company. That meant she had, at least in theory, worked for me before. It was not enough to disqualify her outright, but it was enough to raise uncomfortable questions that could undermine her credibility if brought before a judge. The moment Maya explained the potential angle, I felt something shift inside me. For weeks, I had been playing defense, protecting myself with ledgers, contracts, and old emails, all of which were necessary but reactive. This was the first time I saw a chance to go on offense, to force them to answer for their choices rather than constantly scrambling to answer for mine. Maya drafted a motion to inquire about counsel conflict, attaching the old invoice as evidence, and although we kept the language measured and professional, the message was unmistakable. If they wanted to paint me as reckless and dishonest, they would now have to defend why their own lawyer had once taken money from my company. At the same time, I was painfully aware that as long as the company remained legally tied to my personal name, I would always be vulnerable to another wave of attacks. If my parents were willing to manufacture a story about a family loan, what would stop them from claiming rights to intellectual property, trademarks, or even client lists? I refused to live under that constant threat, so I took the step that changed everything. With the help of an advisor, I signed an irrevocable transfer of all intellectual property and controlling shares into a purpose trust overseen by a small independent board of directors. The trust was designed with one explicit rule: no blood relative of mine could ever sit on it. I remained the executive with full authority to run the business, but legally, I was no longer the sole owner they could target. Even if they managed to win some bizarre judgment, what they would receive would be nothing of value, because the assets were no longer under my personal control. I did not announce what I had done, and I did not hint at it in conversations with anyone. I wanted my parents to walk into that courtroom believing they had me cornered, believing that if they won, they would walk out with keys to my company. I wanted them to taste the illusion of victory right before it dissolved in their mouths. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was the only way to make sure they could not spin the narrative later and claim they had chosen to step back. They needed to experience the humiliation of realizing the game was over before it even began. The days leading up to the hearing were tense, but strangely calm for me. My parents sent messages through Ethan, alternating between threats and attempts at reconciliation, as if they thought I could still be pressured into settling quietly. Ethan texted me one night, bragging that Dad had a friend at the courthouse and that things would go their way no matter what. I stared at that message for a long time, not angry, but almost amused, because it revealed how naive they all were about the actual system. Influence and gossip might win at backyard barbecues or family dinners, but in court, there are filings, evidence, and judges who have no patience for childish games. I saved the message, not because I needed it, but because it reminded me that my brother had become nothing more than their mouthpiece, too eager to parrot lines without realizing how empty they sounded. Maya, on the other hand, was calm, deliberate, and quietly relentless. She did not let me spiral into anger or fear. She simply kept preparing, reviewing documents, organizing witnesses, and making sure that every piece of leverage we had was lined up and ready. Watching her work gave me a sense of control I had not felt in months. For the first time, I believed that not only could we win, but we could win in a way that would leave no room for revisionist history. My parents would not be able to spin this into another tale of family sacrifice. They would be left with nothing but the wreckage of their own attempt. By the time the hearing date finally arrived, I had stopped dreading it. I actually welcomed it because I knew the moves were already in place. The motion about Ruth's conflict would throw her off balance, the trust transfer would nullify any financial grab, and the mountain of evidence we had prepared would crush their manufactured story about family loans. I felt ready in a way I had not felt ready for anything in years. Cliffhanger. When I filed the transfer into the trust, I told no one, not even my closest friends, because I wanted my parents to discover the truth the hard way, in the exact moment when they thought they had finally won. The morning of the hearing, I woke up with a strange sense of calm that I had not felt since the very beginning of this entire ordeal, as if my mind had finally accepted that the worst had already happened and that everything from here forward would simply be the slow process of exposing it in daylight. For weeks I had carried the weight of betrayal, anger, and even shame, replaying every moment when I could have cut my parents out earlier or protected myself more aggressively. But as I got dressed and looked at the stack of folders prepared by Maya, it hit me that I had done something they never expected. I had turned their own obsession with image and control into a trap that was now waiting for them on record. They thought they were marching into that courthouse to claim victory. What they were really walking into was a carefully arranged moment where all their lies, gossip, and manipulation would collapse in front of strangers who had no stake in preserving family illusions. The night before, my mother had tried one last time to pull me back into her version of peace, leaving a voicemail filled with syrupy tones and half-hearted apologies that quickly shifted into ultimatums. She said that if I dropped the trust arrangement and withdrew the motion against Ruth, we could present a united front and rebuild the narrative together, which was her way of saying I should let them continue telling everyone that my success belonged to them. I listened to the message twice, not because I was tempted, but because I wanted to burn into my memory the exact sound of her voice when she was trying to negotiate ownership of something that had never been hers. It was a tone I had heard my whole life, sweet on the surface, but with a blade just underneath, and this time I refused to let it cut. I deleted the voicemail and slept better than I had in months. That morning, when I glanced at the docket and saw the judge's name, I almost laughed, because it unlocked a memory I had buried years ago. Judge Alan Morales had once stood across from me at a neighborhood barbecue, a forgettable Saturday afternoon where my parents spent most of their time loudly mocking my little project to anyone who would listen. They had rolled their eyes at my work hours, made jokes about me playing business, and talked over me whenever I tried to explain what I was building. I remember Morales listening quietly, not inserting himself into the conversation, but later, as my parents wandered off to refill their drinks, he walked over and asked me how my team was holding up. Not my profits, not my projections, my team. He treated me like what I was, a professional trying to build something real. I had not thought about that moment in years, but as soon as I saw his name on the docket, I knew my parents were about to face the one thing they feared most, a judge, who had once seen them without their masks on. Still, I knew better than to rely on personal connections because the courtroom is not a barbecue, and judges are bound by procedure, not memory. That was why Maya and I had prepared a final piece of evidence that would shift the focus away from family drama and onto the concrete damage my parents had tried to inflict. One of our key clients, tired of the interference and harassment, had agreed to write a declaration describing in clear terms how my parents had attempted to manipulate product decisions and demand influence over delivery schedules. The declaration was not dramatic or emotional, it was measured, professional, and devastating, because it showed that their behavior was not about protecting family assets at all, it was about control, even at the cost of sabotaging relationships with paying clients. When Maya filed the declaration, I imagined the look on Ruth's face as she read it. For weeks, she had painted me as ungrateful, reckless, and undeserving, but now there was a signed statement from an outside party making it clear that the real recklessness came from the people she represented. I knew my parents would dismiss it as disloyalty or manipulation because they have never believed anyone outside the family could see through their act, but in court, signed documents carry weight that no amount of charm can erase. Walking into the courtroom, I kept my head high, not because I wanted to project strength, but because I genuinely felt it. My parents sat across the aisle, whispering excitedly, their faces lit with the smugness of people who think they have already won. Ethan sat beside them, tapping on his phone, probably rehearsing the victory posts he planned to upload the moment they walked out. I did not make eye contact because I wanted them to believe, up until the very last second, that I was nervous, cornered, and waiting to be humiliated. Then the judge entered. The bailiff called the room to order, and as everyone rose, I could see my parents practically glowing with confidence. Judge Morales took his seat, glanced around the room, and then his eyes landed on me. For a moment, there was silence, and then he leaned slightly forward and said, almost casually, "Haven't seen you since the family barbecue." The words hung in the air like a hammer. My parents froze, and the color drained from my mother's face so quickly that even Ethan stopped smirking. In that one sentence, Morales had reminded everyone, including the record, that this was not just a faceless dispute over numbers. This was a case where he had once observed the very dynamics at play, long before any filings were made. I did not smile, I did not gloat, and I did not speak. I simply sat there and let the silence do the work. My parents wanted an audience, and they had one, but not the kind they expected. Cliffhanger. As the judge cleared his throat and began the formal proceedings, I realized that the moment I had been waiting for had arrived, because my parents were about to learn that even if they somehow managed to win, they were fighting for control of something that no longer existed in the way they thought it did. When Judge Morales opened with the standard disclosure that he knew the parties socially through the neighborhood and asked, as procedure demands, whether anyone objected to him presiding, I watched Ruth reach for the moment as if it were a gift she had earned, only to realize halfway through her sentence that the disclosure cut both ways, because it did not paint me as favored or compromised so much as it reminded the room that the court understood the difference between family theater and business reality, and that this hearing would not be a referendum on who told the better holiday story, but a review of paper, signatures, and the plain weight of facts that do not bend to gossip. Maya, who had mastered the art of looking almost bored while setting a trap, declined to object, thanked the court, and asked to proceed, and in that small exchange I felt the ground tilt, because my parents had arrived expecting personality to win the day, while we had brought receipts that could stand up. In a storm. Maya began in the least dramatic way possible, which, in a courtroom, is often the most devastating approach, because when you do not raise your voice, you force the other side to hear every word. And she walked the judge through the origin of the company with that quiet precision that had soothed me through the worst nights, laying out the grant paperwork, the bank confirmations of early customer payments, the angel note that had been properly documented and repaid, and finally the little email that I had written years ago in a moment of fear and stubbornness, a simple statement of decline that carried more force than any speech I could make now, and as the words were read into the record, I could feel the shape of the parents' story deflate, because so much of what they needed depended on everyone overlooking that one polite no. The heartbeat ledger came next, and while the word sounds almost sentimental, the thing itself was cold, time-stamped, notarized, and immune to spin, and with each page Maya marked and entered, the fictional family loan faded from a possibility to a ghost to an embarrassment, until Ruth, who is too skilled to panic, asked for a short pause to review and regroup, which the judge granted without comment, because there was nothing to argue against in a ledger that simply exists. When we resumed, Ruth tried to move the fight to higher ground by suggesting that, even if the original funds were disputed, the family had provided non-monetary support that created an equitable claim, and for a second I tasted the old dread. The one that rises when people insist that a lifetime of small slights and manipulations somehow adds up to legal entitlement. But before that dread could settle, Maya replied with the client declaration, the measured statement from someone with no stake in our family dynamics, who explained, in calm language, how my parents had attempted to interfere with product decisions and delivery schedules, how they had tried to leverage their surname to exert control over negotiations, and how their actions could have jeopardized deliverables if we had not held the line. And in that moment the case transformed from a tale of supposed family generosity to a record of attempted business interference, which is the kind of shift that dries the mouth of anyone who came to court wearing nostalgia as armor. Only after the facts were stacked in quiet order did Maya mention the small, easily overlooked detail about Ruth's prior invoice, framed not as a personal attack but as an ethics question worth noting, and while the judge did not dwell on it, I saw the flicker of irritation cross Ruth's features, because being forced to explain a tripwire like that burns time and drains authority, and even when it does not disqualify, it stains the air with the suggestion that the clean lines are not as clean as advertised. Then, when it would matter most, Maya revealed the last card, not with fanfare but with a single sentence that traveled like a blade. The intellectual property and controlling shares of the company had been transferred, weeks prior, into an irrevocable purpose trust overseen by an independent board with an explicit prohibition against any blood relative ever serving, and that I, while still the executive responsible for operations and performance, no longer held the ownership that the petition sought to seize, which meant that even if the court granted every request my parents had made, they would walk away with authority over nothing, because the target they chased did not sit where they imagined. The sound that followed was not dramatic, just a collective intake of breath, the kind people make when they realize a game they thought they understood has end conditions they never studied. And for the first time my mother looked not furious or wounded but genuinely lost, because she had believed that if she pushed hard enough and performed loud enough, the world would bend around her version of events. And now she was staring at a legal structure that did not care about her tone, her posture, or her script. The judge asked a series of questions meant to verify the trust's validity, the timing of the transfer, and the governance rules that separated control from blood, and Maya answered each one with dates and pages and signatures. And when he finally leaned back and folded his hands, he spoke with the weary kindness of someone who has seen families try to turn love into leverage for longer than any of us have been alive, and he denied the emergency request in full, admonishing all parties to avoid further interference and to conduct their lives with the minimum of public damage, which sounds gentle until you realize it leaves one side standing with everything intact and the other side holding a file that now reads like a confession. Outside the courtroom, where people often invent mythology to soothe their egos, I did not wait for my parents to spin, to cry, or to rage, because none of that would change the reality that they had tried to break what I built and failed. So instead, I made an offer that looked like an olive branch but functioned like a lock, telling Ruth I would license the old family name for a token fee if they agreed, in writing and with teeth, to cease contact with my team, to abandon any claim to influence over clients or product, and to stay out of my market. And because pride loves appearances more than outcomes, they accepted. And I walked away having paid nothing and having purchased silence with a contract that protected everyone who actually mattered to me. On the drive back to the office, I waited for the rush of triumph that I thought would feel like fireworks, but what came was steadier and more useful, a kind of grounded relief that allowed me to breathe without flinching. Because I finally understood that peace is not the same as apology, and that closure is not a speech or a hug or a neat family photo, but a boundary written so clearly that no one can pretend to miss it. And when I stepped into the bullpen and saw my team doing what they had always done, shipping, fixing, building, laughing, the wind settled into my bones without needing an audience. And I knew I had done the only thing that mattered by keeping the soul of the company intact while refusing to become the villain in someone else's bedtime story, which is why, when people ask whether I would do it differently if I had the chance, I tell them the truth without ceremony, that I broke the rules you are supposed to follow with family, and I still sleep fine, because I won the only way that counts, with paperwork, restraint, and a final move they never saw coming.